Okay, so we're going to have a fun lecture today, a little bit ad hoc, but it shows some of the tools that we've been using and how you can bring these to some really interesting areas of science. In particular, complex systems, which is trying to understand how nature does the kind of information processing it does, how we see emergent behavior, how we get things like ants, where each individual ant has no idea what your picnic is or how to get bits of it back home, but somehow it accomplishes that task. Things like termites, where one individual termite has no idea how to build this sort of chimney-like structure, which amazingly has air conditioning in it, but it's able to do that when it works together. And so this idea of emergent behavior, and this is very related to the idea of sort of unconventional computing. So things we've hinted at about how you get other kinds of systems, whether it's just inspiration for an algorithm, or you want to actually use the technology to maybe make a biological computer, a computer out of chemistry, and so on. And so this leads directly from the code that we've been running, what you're working on with your convolutional networks. And so I want to show you how powerful this idea of convolution is. And so I've got a notebook here I'm going to post on the GitHub. And the first thing I want you to do is check out this documentary tonight. It's actually from I think the early 70s, maybe even late 60s. And it's about two researchers, Belousov and Zabitsky. And they were in the Soviet Union. And they developed a new chemistry experiment. And if you've ever taken chemistry lab, a lot of times what you do is you take two chemicals, you mix them together, and it changes colors. Right? You put the stuff together, and it turns blue. And maybe the original stuff was yellow. But what typically doesn't happen is it never sort of undoes the chemical reaction. Typically, chemical reactions go one way. When we think of them as dynamical systems and we watch what happens over time, the chemicals come together, they mix, and they stay mixed. And these two guys discovered something called the BZ reaction, which was the first time in history where they discovered an oscillating chemical reaction, where the two chemicals start out sort of yellow, and then it turned blue, and then it turned yellow again, and then it turned blue again, then it turned yellow again, then it turned blue again, and it went back and forth, kind of like a pendulum on a clock, or a kid on a swing, that we saw the behavior move back and forth. And so they wrote this up, and they sent this to the National Academy of Sciences, and their paper was rejected. The editors said, this sort of thing does not happen in nature. You must have done something wrong. But it turns out they had discovered a whole new area of science. And so I want you to watch that documentary, and it'll go over some of the stuff that we're going to look at today. So we had in our notebook, to remind you, this idea of convolution. And we loaded in simple images like this, and we ran this sort of filter, this little tiny matrix, and we moved it across the image, and that filtered our image. That if we run a little feature detector of horizontal lines, then that's the only thing that survives that filter. If we run our feature as a vertical line, then that would be the only thing that survives the image. And so we can think of these like we call them now with our smartphone apps. They really are filters in that they're filtering the data and only letting some of it go through. And then we looked at what random filters would do. They would just kind of scramble up the data and make it blurry, and it kind of looks like a lens out of focus, and that's not an accident or a coincidence. It turns out we can actually do convolution with optics, and I think that's a really cool area if you're interested in physics that you can take a look at, is how do we take things like a lens out of focus and have it do convolution, and how would we build a neural network with something like that. And then we built our homemade double for loop where we saw that we go through each pixel and weight with its neighbors, and we get the new value, and that's this thing we call convolution. And so we saw with things like self-driving car, this can highlight certain roadways, and in your case of your project, you can help exaggerate or diminish certain features that you might be looking for or trying to ignore. So what I want to show you now is how that same technique that we use for image processing can be used to create some really interesting convolution, other models, particularly this idea of cellular automata, where we think of the world made like graph paper, where every little rule is kind of like a little square, and each square has like sort of a kind of a simulated atom or a simulated tree or an ant or whatever our metaphor might be at the time, and then we let it run like a petri dish, and then we look at what happens. And to remind you why this is possible now and why this is exciting for your career is because the computing power has enabled us to do this at scale. A few decades ago, it was very expensive and took forever to do these kinds of experiments. And now we saw with our convolution, they can do the whole thing in just 7 seconds. That would have taken a long time before. But if we run this with a built-in code, this takes 0.08 seconds. So we can use the modern tools that come with Python. And then amazingly, if we use our GPU, we can get this thing to run really fast. So that number's off there, I gotta rerun this. But you can run this one's 96 times, and it will go even faster than that one. Okay, so what we can do is we can filter different images, and that kind of counts the neighbors. And so let me show you now what we can do. We did this with a feature map. This is all like we looked at last time, where we can think of the thing as actually looking for something like a coin, and it gives us a map, like a treasure map of where that feature can be found. And so now what we're going to look at is how we can use this to look for other things, not just in images, but in certain patterns. So a few decades ago, there was a mathematician named Conway, and he made this game on graph paper called the Game of Life. And it started as just a simple math experiment, and it's developed into a very rich area of research. And he said, let's make a simulation of living things where each little square can be either alive or not alive. And we're going to flip through evolution time, kind of one time step at a go. And in every time step, we're going to decide for each little square, should this one be alive or should it die? And he said, well, how does life work? And he said, well, if you're by yourself, you're probably going to die because there's nothing there. If you are overcrowded, if every square around you is turned on, then you're probably going to die from overcrowding. But if exactly 2 or 3 of your neighbors are turned on, then you'll turn on. And if there's only 2, then yours will get turned on as if by reproduction. And so you can change the rules a little bit and get different results. But what I want to show you is how we can use convolution to do the exact same thing. So remember, with convolution, we look at our neighbors. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take a filter that weights all of our neighbors by 1 and ourself by 0. And we're going to use this to calculate a count, so that when we run the convolution filter at every square, the result will be how many of your neighbors are alive at that time step. And so this was just a simple rule that he proposed called the Game of Life. And we'll show this running in just a second. Here's how it starts. You just flip a coin for every square randomly. And then we run the filter, our convolution. So we start this thing out with a bunch of zeros that we're going to store every frame. And then we go through each step and we say, take the world as it exists now, this W, and filter it with our neighbor filter. And the filter F is just going to count the neighbors. And so it's just 1 in every square, except for the middle is a 0. And that acts as a counting of your neighbors. And then it says, if you were already there, which means the W was a 1, and your neighbors is exactly 2, then you'll be turned on. You'll stay alive. Or if you were already 0 and you had exactly 3 neighbors, then you would you would turn on as alive. Otherwise, you're going to disappear. And so this formula encodes this game of life. And then we can look at what happens, and we can save each frame as an animation. And we can animate that. And we have this here. Let's see if we can open this in a new tab. And what's really interesting is from that very simple rule, we get what's called emergent behavior. Very sophisticated patterns start to happen here. And we get the emergence of like little critters. Now, we never asked for these patterns. We just gave it a simple rule, only looking at this basic neighbors. But what you end up seeing is things like gliders. You get stationary patterns, like if you get certain patterns, it'll just stay that way. Other patterns will just sort of ripple. Other patterns move along. And you get all kinds of interesting things. Let me show you some other examples. This one's called the glider gun. And this will create these little critters that just walk down the boardwalk here, right? Now in the rules, it never says make a critter and have it walk across the screen. And so this is emergent behavior. That it's not obvious when you look at the rules that you would get something interesting coming out of it. And if you look, there's all kinds of interesting patterns here that do really interesting things. This one's called a spaceship because the whole thing kind of just walks down like a whole unit and keeps itself stable. It's a stable pattern. And that's what you are. You're a stable pattern. As you go through life, from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday and so on, you maintain that pattern even though all kinds of different things are happening to you. And so this is sort of a mathematical approximation for life and dynamics. So I'll post this link. I want you to go through and take a look at some of these interesting patterns. There's tons of them that you can look at. And what's interesting is all the different things that you can build from this. So what's fascinating about computers is they can simulate things. And one of the most interesting things you can simulate with a computer is another computer. And so we can take this game of life. We're still just running this very simple convolution. It's a very simple filter. It's only looking at one square at a time, or just one square out in terms of your neighbors. But if we set up the pattern, we can build these entire worlds. And this one's set up in a very particular way that it's going to simulate something at a different scale. And so we're going to see the emergence of another system that's made out of these. So just like atoms have these very simple rules from the periodic table, and then if you get enough of them together, they have sports games and picnics and stuff. Here, if we get enough of this simple rule, and we configure it in just the right way, we can get it to simulate something. What is it that it's simulating here? It's simulating itself. So we have this game of life built out of game of life. Right? It's like a fractal, and then if you zoom in on it, you get back to the same thing. And so this was the very first critter that we saw, and so you could run that again and again. And so the idea is this is sort of a model of maybe the universe is built out of things like this. Maybe this is what atoms are doing, this is what space-time is doing. These very kind of simple patterns. So take a look at this lexicon. There's one that's really interesting called the acorn. Let me see if I can find that one. Right? A very simple pattern, just a few squares, the same rule. The rule never changes. And if we just run this, it will just go. It'll make all of this kind of complexity, that it'll be very difficult to predict the state of this pattern without actually just running it. The only practical way of knowing what this will look like 100 steps later is to just run it. There's no shortcutting it. So the guy who developed a lot of this, Wolfram, he talks about computational irreducibility, that you can't shortcut it. And a lot of times in nature, the only way to know what's going to happen is to actually just run it. And so this is called the game of life, and I encourage you to take a look at that. Okay, so now let's take that same system and do it again, except now we are going to count ourselves in the rule. So we're going to take almost the exact same filter, except we're going to put a 1 in the middle. So now we have a filter of all 1s. And then we have a very similar rule that says if you're less than 4 or equal to 5, and then take the opposite of that. And so you can imagine trying all different kinds of possibilities, and you can go through later and try to understand why this is working in terms of the matrix math and rewrite it. You can ask ChatGPT to rewrite that into if-then statements if you want. But writing it this way makes it go really fast. And so this is just a slightly different rule. And now we're not simulating the game of life, we're simulating surface tension. And then, so this is kind of like if you have a drop of water on your desk that kind of beads up and then it will evaporate. And so we get a completely different area of physics, something like evaporation, out of almost exactly the same kind of simulation framework. We just change the settings just a little bit. But maybe this would be good for drug design, drug discovery. You want to figure out how things actually kind of diffuse through your system, or how the different chemicals interact as they evaporate. Or maybe you just want to know things like water loss in the desert. And so again, the same convolution is building a very different model again. Okay, so now we can take another one, and we can say, well, now the squares have 3 different settings. We can say they're empty, they're a green tree, or they're on fire. And what we can do is we can have a simple rule where we every so often, the rare chance, we set the thing on fire with lightning, and then every so often we grow a new tree. So we'll take almost the same filter, we won't include our center square, and then we'll have the rule that basically says, if one of your neighbors is on fire, you're on fire. If you get a seed by some chance, you will turn into a tree. Otherwise, you'll just continue the way you are. And so this rule encodes a simulation of a forest fire, where we can see the trees here in beige. They sort of start to grow, and then every once in a while we get a lightning strike, and then that will take off across the forest as a whole wave. And so this is why it's actually sometimes better to harvest some of the trees in the forest, because if you get too many trees, then there's a chance that the forest fire will wipe out the whole thing. If the density is relatively low, the forest fire doesn't go that far. It sort of goes for a little bit, and then it hits an area with no trees, and it sort of burns itself out. But if it gets too thick and too dense, then you get these massive fires that sweep across the whole thing. Right, so now we've got abstract biology, we've got the physics of water drops, and we've got forest fires, all with this same convolution math. So let's change the rules one more time. In this case, it's almost the same thing, except we're going to add lots of different states. We're going to say that that each little square can exist in state 1 through 9. And basically, if you're in state 2, you go to 3. If you're in 3, you go to 4. If you're in 4, you go to 5. So it just kind of ticks along. And then once you get to 9, you reset back to 0. Right? And so this is called a non-linear wave. Right? We can do one right now. I'm going to do like the stadium, right? Go ahead. Go. Yep, go. And over here. Come on. Now to the back. Right? That's a non-linear wave. You're waiting for your neighbor, and you see your neighbor with your hands up, then you put your hands up, then you put them back down. When you think of the stadium with the wave, nobody's moving, right? There's no people actually moving. It's just sort of that activation. And it turns out that that's how your heart synchronizes its beating. And you have these pacemaker cells that are trying to send out these ripples. And if you've ever seen in the medical shows when they have the paddles and they go clear, right? What they're trying to do is to reset these oscillation waves because they can get out of balance. And we can get these patterns where we can think of each little square as a person standing in the stadium, and when the neighbor gets to them, they raise their hand, and then when the wave goes by, they put their hands back down. And so we can kind of see this both in your heart and also in morphogenesis, how your body decided to be the pattern that you are. And so the idea is that we get all of these very different patterns from this same kind of system, this same idea of convolution. It's very fundamental in physics and in this kind of nonlinear chemistry and complex systems. If we smooth that out a little bit and we change this operator just a little bit, we can get patterns like this, which kind of look like zebra stripes, kind of look like fish. You know, if you imagine on your arm or on your head, you've got, your hair, there's a spot that has hair, a spot that doesn't have hair. And then on zebra stripes, you've got a spot that's a zebra, the stripe, and then a spot that's not a stripe. How does each individual patch of skin know to be a stripe or not? And you think, oh, well, it's in the DNA. But every cell gets the exact same code. Every cell has the exact same DNA. And so we need another system that emerges during development, and that's this reaction diffusion called morphogenesis. This is what Alan Turing worked on late in his life because he felt this was an important area to build future computers. They needed to evolve and build and construct themselves, and we had to use recipes like nature to do that. And so we get to sort of very different patterns depending on how this thing starts out in the beginning. And then the last one here I want to show you is one called Wire World, which is really interesting. It's a lot like the others, but what you do is you simulate electricity. And so it's kind of a digital electronics, where each little square, it can be sort of background empty, nothing's there. You can have a wire, and then we have electrons. But in this case, the electron has a head and a tail. And we represent the head with a 1 and the tail with a 2. And so they each get their own color. And just like the forest fire, we sort of have a rule that if your neighbor was turned on and you weren't, then you turn on if you were a conductor. And if you were a head, you turn into a tail. And if you were a tail, you turn back into a conductor. And you think, well, what in the world would that do? And it actually simulates electricity sort of going down the wire. That if we start this thing out with a head and a tail at one end, it will just scoot automatically. But it's important to remember, this is just the same loop, right? It's like in the Matrix, there is no spoon. There is no little critter here, right? Just like you didn't move out of your seat, nothing is moving down the screen except for the pattern. And we didn't ask it. Normally with other computer languages, you'd say, I want a little critter, and it has this position, and I have an update rule, and I'm going to animate it moving across. No, we're just applying the same kind of physics on a loop, and what emerges is that. And what's fascinating by this is the different things that you can build. That we can build things like a clock. That if we put a loop pattern and then a tail there, that this thing will go in circles, and every time it gets to that junction, it will kick off, like the gliders, it will kick off a new one of these simulated electrons. And so depending on how we set this loop will depend how often these spikes go out. And that kind of looks like neuron spikes that you could use for signaling. And so what's extraordinary is if we put this together, we can make wires. Here's our oscillator patterns. And then what we can do is we can build that into an actual computer. Here we have a pattern that we can actually draw a computer out of these grids. And then if we set this thing in motion, then what this is going to do is actually run this computer. So I'll pull that up in a second with the animation. But what this will actually do is count out the prime numbers. And so at every square, we're applying the exact same rule. The squares have no idea they're participating in a circuit. They're only looking at one neighbor away. And in here, we have things like bus and register and flip-flops. And we actually can build a processor, and then this calculates the prime numbers as it runs. And what's interesting is when astrobiologists go out and they try to look for life across the universe, they say if we find prime numbers, then we'll have found something alive or intelligent. But this is a very simple recipe that calculates the prime numbers. So that's what I wanted to kind of show you as a teaser for complex systems research that you can get involved in, and how you can take the tools that you're using in this course and bring them to all kinds of other areas of science.